All right, hello and welcome to the podcast Between the Headlines: What's reported, what's omitted, and why it matters. I'm Jonathan and I'm going to be the mediator today, and I will try to introduce you to two perspectives on two tragic conflicts with the help of my colleagues. Here with us is Lisa, who will document how Ukraine survives Russian bombardment and how this war is portrayed from both sides of the propaganda divide. Also with us is Johannes, who will take us to Gaza, where streets are buried beneath rubble of shattered hopes, and to the West Bank, where even children know the word occupation. He will speak of how one people's pain collides with another's and how truth shatters into thousand fragments that can never be pieced back together. Both of these countries are torn apart by war and unlawful occupation by a foreign power, and they have been for quite some time. Even though there are a lot of similarities in these wars, the media coverage and frames of the wars have been wildly different from each other, both in mainstream and social media. In this podcast, we will have a look at what those differences are, and we will look for an explanation of these different approaches. But before we do, it's important to understand the roots of both of these conflicts. We will start with the war in Ukraine. On February 22nd of 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine after weeks of news about Russian troops gathering on the Ukrainian border. To understand the conflict, we have to go back to 2014. All over the country, thousands and thousands of Ukrainians took to the streets to protest the pro-Russian regime at the time. These protests, called the Maidan protests, provoked counter-protests from pro-Russian Ukrainians in the east and the south of the country. The pro-Russian president at the time, Viktor Yanukovych, was ousted after the pro-EU Maidan protests. He was succeeded by the more European-orientated Petro Poroshenko in what were, regarded by international observers, honest, open, and democratic elections. After the Revolution of Dignity, as the shift in Ukrainian politics was later called, Russian armed forces, believed to be mercenaries of the infamous Wagner Group, took over the Ukrainian peninsula of the Crimea, and not long thereafter a referendum was organized which resulted in the Russian annexation of the Crimea. The legitimacy of that referendum was highly disputed. In April 2014, the protests of the pro-Russian forces in eastern Ukraine became more violent and turned into rebellions. These Russia-backed rebels took over several cities and towns in the Donbas region, resulting in the declaration of the People's Republic of Lugansk, PLR, and in Donetsk People's Republic. In turn, these republics resulted in the Donbas War. Soon after, Russia urged Ukraine to negotiate with the leaders of the PLR and the DPR. Those negotiations were attended by representatives of Russia, Ukraine, and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE. These negotiations ended up producing the first Minsk agreement. Months later, a second round of negotiations was initiated, after the terms of the first Minsk agreement were continuously violated. These negotiations produced the Minsk II agreement. After the Minsk agreements, the conflict in eastern Ukraine stagnated and the fronts did not move. That is until the invasion in February 2022. Russia rapidly gained territory, and in the first months of the war, at the height of the invasion, a quarter of Ukrainian territory was in Russian hands. In the last months, however, the fronts have not changed significantly. And even though Ukraine was able to conquer some Russian territory, Russia was able to regain control over the Kursk region with the help of thousands of North Korean troops, shortly after it was invaded by Ukraine. We've analyzed the war in Ukraine in terms of numbers, maps, and dry summaries, but there's another side to the war, the one that sounds in underground studios, in the kitchens of immigrants, and in the texts of those who have been declared traitors in Russia. Now you will hear something that is never played on Russian TV, the song No One Was Injured, which became part of the album in which Russian musicians Noise MC and Monetochka actively spoke out about their anti-war position. This one song is from the Voices of Peace project, created to help people whose lives were destroyed by the war. These musicians visited 10 European capitals with charity concerts and raised 340,000 euros to help Ukrainian refugees.
Can we trust the author? Is there really a war? We will never know the full truth. We cannot verify everything. We cannot gather all the will and drain all the tears. We cannot get everyone from the field. We cannot bury them all. No one was injured. Fake news. It's a plant. A robot astronaut sends a message from distant stars. No intelligent life found on enemy planet. Target destroyed. No one was injured.
You have just heard Russian musicians who risk their freedom to sing the truth about the war. But if we travel 3,000 kilometers south to Palestine, we will find surprisingly similar voices. There, among the ruins, music is born that cannot be heard on Israeli radio.
My blood is Palestinian and my eyes never sleep. Because I live in dreams, because I've seen so much pain. Soon I will return to my country and I'm coming from far away. I'm coming from far away to live for freedom.
The author of the song that represents an anthem of the Palestinian people's claim to their land is the Palestinian singer Mohammed Asaf, winner of Arab Idol in 2013. Unfortunately, this song has been removed from the main music streaming platforms because apparently it incites against Israel. It's another example of how the Western world is polarized against the Palestinians, and many actions and demonstrations in support of the Palestinian cause are exploited by Israel, portraying them as actions inciting hatred against Israel and labeling them as anti-Semitic. However, the author stated that even if they remove this song, it remains in the conscience of every Palestinian and every human being who believes in freedom. For the context of the conflict between Israel and Palestine, we have to go back a little further back in time, about a century to be more precise. During the First World War, Great Britain made 3 promises. The first one was to the leader of Arabic tribes, whom they promised could reign over the Middle East after the Ottoman Empire would have been defeated. The second promise was to the Organization of European Jews, whom they promised that they could establish a home country in Palestine. Lastly, they promised the French that they would split up the Middle East after the Ottoman defeat. After the war, Britain tried to keep its promises, handing what is now Syria to the French, allowing a large number of Jews to settle in Palestine, and installing 2 Arabic kings to reign over what are now Iraq and Jordan. With the rise of Nazism in Germany and other fascist and anti-Semitic movements in the 1930s all across Europe, more and more Jews moved to Palestine. This caused anger with the Palestinians, who thought that there were now too many foreigners coming to their land. They started to rebel against the British occupiers, who allowed the European Jews to come in. The British then proposed the establishment of a Jewish state and an Arabic state, dividing the land. The Jews reacted positively, but the Palestinians were indignant, and they refused the offer, not willing to give up any of their land. After the Second World War, even more Jews came to Palestine, and the situation escalated. Jewish organizations started committing terrorist attacks against the British occupiers, even killing a representative of the United Nations who came to negotiate about the situation. Trying to solve the conflict, the United Nations provided a new plan for the division of a Palestinian and a Jewish state, but in the new proposal, the Jews were given a territory 1.5 times larger than in the previous proposal. Outraged, the Palestinians refused the proposal again. The British were done with it and didn't want to have to deal with the situation anymore. So, a year after the first UN proposal, they withdrew from the territory. This meant a power vacuum in Palestine, which resulted in the Jews establishing their own state. They were very well prepared and rapidly conquered territory appointed to them in the UN proposal, plus some extra. They killed and ousted 700,000 Palestinians from their homes in what the Palestinians call the Nakba. The Nakba almost immediately resulted in the first Arab-Israeli war, where neighboring countries attacked Israel because they disagreed with the Israeli treatment of Palestinian Arabs. Almost 20 years later, in 1967, the second Arab-Israeli war started, when Israel attacked neighboring countries and occupied part of their territories, where a lot of Palestinians lived. At first, Israel saw the occupied territories as negotiation material, willing to give them back if the Arab countries would recognize Israel and sign a formal peace agreement. But Israel stayed silent about the Palestinians, which made the Arab countries remain in their hostile approach. At first, it was mostly Israel's neighboring Arab countries that stood up for the rights of the Palestinians. But slowly, Palestinians took up the resistance themselves too. Displaced Palestinians in Syria and Lebanon started the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or the PLO, in 1964 to take their homes and control over their country. Some of these fighters also committed terrorist attacks by attacking civilian targets, and in this period, the Western world came to know Palestinians mainly as terrorists. In 1982, Israel reacted to the continuous terrorist attacks by invading Lebanon. They expelled the PLO fighters to Tunisia and massacred Palestinian refugees living in Lebanon. Not long after, Hamas was founded by the Palestinians living in the occupied territories of Gaza and the West Bank. In contrast to the PLO, Hamas was very religious. This may have resulted in the conflict getting a more religious tone overall in recent years. In 1993, the PLO and Israel came to the Oslo Agreements, which were considered monumental at the time. But they did not change much, as both Hamas and Israel did not comply with the terms of the agreement. Israel also started building settlements in the occupied territories, something which is considered illegal under international law. Some of these settlements have turned into large cities over the course of decades. On October 7th, 2023, Hamas launched the worst terrorist attack in the history of the conflict. About 1,200 Israelis were killed and 250 were taken as hostages. Victims were tortured and raped. In reaction, Israel launched a full-scale attack on the Gaza Strip, from where the terrorist attack was planned and committed, and also where the Israeli hostages were taken to. Israel continuously violates international law and even has been accused of committing genocide in Gaza, killing tens of thousands of people, including women and children. And also, just this week, Israel threatened to take over control of the Gaza Strip and move civilians if Hamas couldn't agree to release the hostages. So, Johannes, as we have already mentioned, there are many reasons why the media reports so differently in both quality and quantity on a given issue. Now we want to take a closer look at the genocide in Gaza and war in Ukraine and how they have been covered by different news outlets. But perhaps first, a more general question. What role does traditional media even play today in times where social media and alternative media gets more and more important?
Yes, that's true. Social media is becoming more and more important, but nevertheless, many people still get their news from large media outlets and consider them to be the only reliable news source. They are usually more trusted than alternative media. Traditional media outlets can be private or state owned. Private media houses often have their own political agenda that they represent and a corresponding audience that they want to address. But even state media, which consider themselves to be more neutral, are never completely political neutral, but are, some more and some less, dependent on interests of their governments.
Okay, and after the Hamas attacks on October 7th, you could find this story on the front page of almost every major newspaper in the world. How were the reactions? Maybe you can give us some impressions?
Indeed, they were really, really different. And of course, there are so many perspectives, and I think we can't cover all of them, but let's try to look at some examples. For example, the New York Times called it "Militants Stage a Large-Scale Infiltration into Israel." And the Wall Street Journal titles, "Israel's First 24 Hours Under Attack, quote unquote, we are going to die." The Jerusalem Post writes, "Israel at war. Israel embassy reports 100 Israelis kidnapped." And on the other hand, Al Jazeera, an Arab news outlet, titled, "Why the Palestinian group Hamas launched an attack on Israel. All to know." So we can see Western outlets largely emphasized Israeli civilian suffering, while Arab media framed the attack as a response to long-standing occupation. And for example, Russian news agencies, they sometimes draw parallels with the Ukraine, for example, comparing Gaza with the Donbas.
And Israel's military response was swift and massive. Airstrikes leveled entire neighborhoods in Gaza. And by late October, over 10,000 Palestinians were reported dead, many of them women and children. Hospitals, schools, and refugee camps were hit. I guess that was also criticized, right?
Of course, it was criticized. And maybe we can take a look for a moment at the case of the Al Ali Arab Hospital explosion, because I think that's a quite good example, and it became like a media war in itself. On October the 17th, 2023, an explosion occurred at the Al Ali Hospital in Gaza, killing about 500 people. The hospital contained not only many injured people who had been treated there, but also many people who had sought refuge. thinking they would be safe in a hospital. And immediately after this explosion, the various parties blamed each other. While the Hamas said it was an Israeli bombing, the Israeli army claimed it was misfired rocket from Gaza. So, and until to this day, there is no conclusive evidence as to who was responsible for the explosion.
And how did the media react?
So most media outlets called it like something like blast that killed hundreds. So they were not blaming one of the parties. But you could also read headlines that quote the statements from the different parties. For example, Al Jazeera wrote, Israeli air raid on Al-Ali Arab Hospital kills 500, Gaza officials say. Or almost exactly the same in the other direction. Like Al-Ali Hospital explosion likely caused by Palestinian rocket, Human Rights Watch say. There was in the Israeli newspaper Haaretz. And you could read in Germany's largest newspaper, Bild, quote unquote, not Israel. Terrorists bombed hospital in Gaza. And they took their information from the Israeli Defense Forces.
It's like the famous saying, like the first casualty of war is the truth.
Exactly. And I think that touches on a central question in the role of media reporting in wars. Because where does the information actually come from? The work of journalists in war zones is extremely difficult, and it's often impossible to get independent information. And at the same time, you have to be aware that the conflicting parties have a strong interest in a particular narrative. The information should be therefore be handled with extreme care. But unfortunately, that is not often not the case.
Lisa, as far as I know, we can see almost an identical scenario in Ukraine. A lot of deaths, shocking footage, mutual accusations. Can you tell us something about it?
Yeah, on 9th of March, the Ukrainian authorities reported the shelling of maternity hospital in Mariupol by Russian troops. As a result, 3 people, including a child, were killed and 17 were injured, and photos taken by the journalist Evgeny Maloletka shocked the world community. The next day, anonymous Telegram channels claimed that the attack was staged and the hospital was controlled by Azov fighters, and Russian newspaper called it a fake of the West, claiming that the injured woman was a model in makeup. And Komsomolskaya Pravda stated that all the photos were taken by one person and show the same woman in different images. Russian Defense Ministry spokesman Igor Konashenkov supported this version, calling the incident a provocation to incite anti-Russian hysteria. However, as of now, there is no definitive evidence confirming who exactly carried out the shelling or from where the attack originated.
And when discussing Russian news coverage, many media outlets and TV channels refer to the war in Ukraine as a special military operation and label the Ukrainian army as Nazis. Is this journalism or is this propaganda? What essentially characterizes the Russian news landscape?
Many Russians support the war against Ukraine, and news play a key role in that. Propaganda generates falsehoods and distorts the truth, but propaganda is not always about outright lying. It's about creating a lens through which we perceive everything around us, including the war. And in the mirror image we see, although there are contrasts with the Russian propaganda or Western propaganda or storytelling, if we put it in a more accurate way. For example, the Kremlin-controlled news agency has repeatedly released the news about Kremlin declaring genocide of Russian-speaking population in Ukraine as a very reason of war, but the Western media widely covered it as a false claims, and this false claims a way to justify the invasion of Georgia in 2008 and annexation of Crimea in 2014.
About the word genocide, its definition is clearly enshrined in the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, entered into force in 1951 and ratified by 153 nation states, according to which genocide means acts as one, killing members of a group, 2, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of said group, 3, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group.
In the case of the war in Gaza, we can see accusations of genocide as well. In January 2022, 2024, South Africa filed a case at the International Court of Justice accusing Israel of genocide under the Genocide Convention. This made global headlines. And while many news outlets stay quite vague, like for example the French Le Monde, they titled What's at Stake with the International Court of Justice Genocide Case Against Israel. There were also some that have clear positions against the genocide accusations. Like for example the Jerusalem Post titled South African Genocide Claims at ICJ Are Baseless. Or also Fox News responded with It's absurd that Israel must defend itself at the ICJ against genocide charges following the October 7th attack. In late January, the International Court of Justice issued provisional measures ordering Israel to prevent genocidal acts and allow humanitarian aid, but no definitive ruling if it is a genocide or not.
We talk a lot about how the war in Ukraine is covered through the prism of Kremlin propaganda, but I would also like to know how objectively the Western media covers the war in Ukraine.
I would say that the greater percentage of the materials from the New York Times, CNN, or Le Monde are submitted exclusively from the Ukrainian position. If Russian arguments appear, it's only as a target for immediate refutation. Western news often play on the emotions of its readers and contains heartwarming stories of Ukrainians. Russian casualties, such as the shelling of Belgrade, are shown 5-7 times less frequently. But the most interesting thing is the selection of facts. When the Ukrainian armed forces liberated Kherson, it was in the front pages of all newspapers. When Russia took Bakhmut, after 8 months of fighting, modest notes on the 10th page. The difference in lighting is enormous. But the main difference from Russian propaganda is that Western media rarely invent facts, but they masterfully place accents. What should we put in a title? What should we mention briefly? Which quote should we trim? It's not a lie, it's a hierarchy of truth.
We've talked about how state run news shapes public perception, but what happens when the war moves to your phone? Can you walk us through how social media became a weapon in the war in Ukraine?
Yeah, fake news stories flooded the internet. Russian state media pushed claims that Ukraine was run by neo-Nazi. Entire networks of bots and trolls amplified these messages, often on platforms with weak moderation like Telegram and VK. Here's one more example, so-called Ghost of Kiev, a legendary Ukrainian pilot who shot down 6 Russian jets. It inspired hope and pride, but was later debunked. And turns out the video that started it came from a flight simulator game. Even more sophisticated was the doppelganger operation, where fake websites mimicked real ones, like again Le Monde or Fox News, and published fake articles attacking Ukrainian refugees or denying the effectiveness of Western sanctions.
We see that the media coverage of the war in Ukraine often includes fake information, both from the Russian and the Ukrainian sides. As for Gaza, starting from October 7th, 2023, media coverage continues to expand as actively as the war in Ukraine, right?
Yes, if until 7th October only a few activists and people who really know a lot about this topic shared materials about Gaza and Palestine, now we are faced with a flood of photos, videos, and artificial intelligence products about Palestine, which on the one hand help by raising people's awareness, but on the other hand, anesthetizing us to death and pain, and that is especially thanks to social media.
Can you give us some examples on that? Like, how are symbols or memes used by people to express solidarity with Gaza online?
Let's take, for example, the watermelon emoji. Maybe you have seen it. It is popping up everywhere on Instagram captions, X threads, and TikTok comments. And it's a simple fruit, but it is also a symbol that stands for the colors of the Palestinian flag, like red, green, black, and white. And it is also a symbol of resistance. And creators adopted it almost overnight to dodge automated censorship and to signal solidarity in a way that algorithms couldn't easily flag. But also another viral phenomenon was the All Eyes on Rafah graphic, that was an AI generated image showing refugee tents and spelling out the campaign's name. And it was shared millions of times on Instagram and reposted as TikTok transitions. And it featured celebrities like the model Bella Hadid urging followers to demand a ceasefire. And while critics argued that a highly polished AI image risked sanitizing the brutal human suffering on the ground, there is really no doubt it succeeded in cutting through the noise and flooding feeds with a single unmissable slogan. The image was shared over 50 million times on Instagram.
But are AI products always used in a good way in addressing the situation in Palestine, or could they also be means of propaganda?
Yeah, of course, they can be used as means of propaganda, like other AI products lead to misinformation. A striking example of how misinformation blends with propaganda is maybe the video recently shared by Donald Trump that showed him what he claimed to be a vision for a new Gaza, which was like a modern cityscape complete with shiny skyscrapers, palm trees, hotels, and the video was entirely AI generated. And while some supporters praised it as a message for hope, many criticized it as a dystopian erasure of Palestinian suffering, using artificial imagery to override the reality of ongoing destruction.
And what are the risks of sharing this kind of content online? Is there a risk of censorship or misinformation?
Of course, yeah, there's a risk. For example, content moderation struggles to keep pace, and Human Rights Watch, for example, documented more 1,000 takedowns of Palestinian and solidarity content on Facebook and Instagram between October and November 2023. And that raises the question about algorithmic bias. TikTok itself reported removing 3.1 million videos and suspending over 140,000 live streams for guideline violations in Israel and Palestine during the same period. We have to remember that not all the content we see on a daily basis is accurate. Clips from the game Arma 3 were passed off as live Gaza combat. Old footage of unrelated Middle East conflicts resurfaced as proof of current atrocities. And these deepfakes and out of context videos spread so fast that in the first days of the October violence, many users couldn't really tell the difference of like fiction and reality. The scramble to fact check every clip became a full-time job for digital users. And what should ordinary user do in this case, you could ask? I think, first of all, it's important to always check the source. If an account was created yesterday and publishes only sensationalism, this would be a red flag for me. Secondly, you can search for the original through image search. Third, use tools like Invid to verify metadata. I think the truth still exists, but now it needs to be mined like gold in a river of fakes.
What we see in Ukraine and Gaza has become not only a geopolitical upheaval, but also a cultural phenomenon. Movies, documentaries, animation are all attempting to make sense of this tragedy, simultaneously serving as weapons, therapy, and memorials. Some create propaganda, while others use metaphors to convey pain that cannot be expressed directly.
Well, when war comes to cartoons, it means that it has really come. I've already really interesting example of it. The Russian state produced animated film A Tale of Vanya and Mikola. It tells the story of two little boys, Russian Vanya and Ukrainian Mikola, who were friends. But Mikola finds new friends and starts bullying his old classmates, hitting them with a stick. Vanya warns him that hurting friends is wrong. Mikola promises to stop but secretly continues. And eventually, Vanya snaps, takes the stick and breaks it. At this point, Mikola's new friends, boys wearing shirts with the German and American flags, raise an uproar, and voiceover asks, why did they stay silent when Mikola was beating his classmates? The story then shifts from a children's conflict to international relations, framing it as an allegory for Russia and Ukraine, claiming that Ukraine oppressed Russian-speaking populations in Donetsk and Lugansk, leading them to seek independence. When Ukraine refused and began shelling them, Russia tried to resolve the conflict peacefully via Minsk agreements, but Ukraine violated them, and Russia had to disarm Ukraine to protect the breakaway regions. And then the film claims certain countries accuse Russia of starting the war. Meanwhile, a Ukrainian state-produced cartoon follows exactly similar plot, but this time it's a Russian Ivan bullying Ukrainian Mikola. Ivan steals Mikola's toys, hits him, then plays the victim, claiming Mikola started it. In one scene, Mikola attends a beautiful school with European Union flags, while Ivan's skulls is crumbling, fueling his envy of Mikola. The story then transitions into Ukraine's conflict with Russia from Kyiv's perspective. It's striking how these two animations don't just share a similar premise, they mirror each other exactly. It's as if one side propaganda is directly countering the others.
In this case, if propaganda cartoons are a war for the youngest and future films have become its adult version, where animation uses metaphors and simplified images, cinema pretends to be realistic. I think its lies are all the more dangerous in this sense. Can we trace how the war in Ukraine turns into diametrically opposed plots on different sides of the cinematic front?
One such controversial example I have is the Oscar-winning 20 Days in Mariupol, a documentary by a Ukrainian director that captures the war through the efforts of journalists. But there is often an illusion that documentary film is a pure truth, as if the events happened, were filmed, edited, and therefore must be factual. In reality, even documentary filmmaking is an artistic construct. Editing, shoot selection, all of it shapes a particular narrative. This film is cinema tailored for a specific audience. It operates like a hammer striking the same point. Russians are evil, look at these children under the fire, more children, a woman, how could this happen? Of course, these images leave no one indifferent. They provoke shock. But because of this emotional power, the film should be approached with a degree of critical detachment. What's most interesting here, it's not the film itself, but the reaction among Russian critics. Almost none of them approached their analysis impartially. Some made inappropriate and even absurd claims, insisting that Russian documentaries are far more honest, or dismissing 20 Days in Mariupol as enemy propaganda.
But there's always a few truths. How about turning the page to another camera?
The Russian documentary, The Battle for Mariupol Through an Eyewitness, speaks different language to us. There are soldiers who are sure that they bring in liberation, mothers who thank them for bread and water, the ruined streets, which are called not a tragedy, but the price of victory. When Russian producer Maxim Fadeev, known for his ties to the Kremlin, released this film in 2023, he announced his intention to show the objective truth. However, a close analysis reveals that this is a very well-designed propaganda product. From a technical point of view, this is a typical product of Russian television, mix of amateur filming and interviews with the local residents and the military. And the main feature is the complete absence of an author's commentary, only the voices of participants and footage of a destroyed city. The film is based on three key points. The Russian army liberated the city from the Nazi, the Ukrainian troops themselves destroyed Mariupol, and civilians are really grateful for liberation. On the one hand, they're really strong shoots in the film, like drone footage showing the scale of destruction is especially impressive. But on another hand, the viewer is presented with an exclusively pro-Russian version of events, where all eyewitnesses, without exception, support the actions of a Russian army, and alternative points of view are completely absent. And this tape still retains a certain value. It captures images of destroyed city, demonstrated the mechanisms of creating a media narrative, and showed the modern propaganda technologies in action. This strange fusion of a real tragedy and fake historical canvas makes you wonder how to treat such documentaries.
In my opinion, when we watch films about the war in Ukraine, it doesn't matter if it's a Russian or Ukraine made film, we can still see the reality amongst the accusations and criticism. These films have somehow become a chronicle of destruction and the incredible resilience of man in the face of death. But if we shift the focus to the Middle East, to Gaza, we'll probably find similar footage, right?
Yes, one recent and striking example is the documentary winner of an Oscar, No Other Land, that was published in 2024. It was co-directed by a Palestinian activist, Basel Adra, and an Israeli journalist, Yuval Abraham, which offers an intimate ground-level view of the forced evictions in the West Bank. And in a more allegorical and dramatic vein, the film Crescendo, hashtag Make Music Not War, of 2019. It tells like the story of an Israeli Palestinian youth orchestra using music as a metaphor for reconciliation and the challenges of dialogue. No Other Land explores the experience of the expulsion of several Palestinians from the territory of Masafariyata in the West Bank. In particular, Palestinians' villages are being destroyed by the Israeli army due to an order issued by the Israeli Supreme Court, which allows the soldiers to take the land and turn it into a military training area. The demolitions occur in a brutal way, with Israeli soldiers threatening the Palestinian families and not even allowing them to take their personal belongings from their homes.
While most war documentaries opt for detached observation, this film's unprecedented and emotionally raw directness forces viewers to confront uncomfortable truths head on. But what I was wondering, like, what emerges most strongly from the documentary?
Besides the cruelty and injustice the Palestinians are subjected to, what emerges is a profound sense of frustration and exhaustion. A deep, chronic exhaustion that comes from enduring injustice for so long. This makes anger no longer erupt, but settle into something quieter, heavier, and more enduring. It's not that they have accepted their reality, but that they have been forced to live with it for so long and that their resistance has taken on a quieter, more persistent form. And this is clearly visible in the different approaches of Basel and Yuval, the directors and main characters of the documentary. Yuval expresses urgency. He wants to write more articles, produce more content, and is frustrated that a video of a grieving mother didn't get enough views. And Basel, however, reacts by criticizing Yuval's enthusiasm, saying he gets too easily excited, as if expecting to fix everything in a matter of days before returning home. Basel reminds him that this struggle has lasted for decades. Get used to failure, you're a loser, he says, not to offend, but to underline the long, grinding nature of resistance. While Yuval's passion comes from the fresh shock of witnessing injustice, Basel's attitude reflects the endurance of someone who has lived through it for years. Someone who knows that change is slow and that real resistance means holding on, continuing even when nothing seems to change. Keep going without seeing results. That's the challenge.
How is the relationship between Palestinians and Israelis explored in the other movie you mentioned, Crescendo?
Their relationship is complex and fraught with tension, as the characters struggle to overcome their personal and political differences. While the orchestra serves as a symbol of unity and hope, the challenges of working together are evident, reflecting the broader conflict between two nations. The film highlights the difficulty of achieving harmony in a context defined by division and violence, and the emotional strain faced by both Palestinians and Israelis to try to bridge the gap through art and cooperation. The orchestra, as is said before, serves as a metaphor for the possibility to reconciliation and dialogue. However, this concept feels increasingly out of reach in the current context, where a growing number of Israelis, fueled by years of indoctrination, view the Palestinians not as potential partners but as enemies to be erased and subjugated. The humanization process, reinforced by years of brainwashing and manipulation by the Israeli government, has borne bitter fruit, creating a generation of Israelis who are ready to commit war crimes, believing that they are justified by by doing so. This warped perception of right and wrong has become deeply ingrained.
So, we try to cover some aspects of two dreadful conflicts currently taking place in our time. Through news, social media, and films, we highlighted how the truth is often manipulated and how difficult it is to access reliable sources of information. It's clear that Western news and media apply a double standard in their coverage, often taking sides in these conflicts. In the case of the Russia-Ukraine war, Western press coverage is predominantly aligned with Ukraine, giving limited space to the Russian perspective. Meanwhile, in the case of the genocide in Gaza, the coverage tends to favor Israel due to historical, social, and economic ties, as well as the influence of the United States. Another key point we emphasized is how social media can be a powerful tool to expose what's hidden by state-oriented press coverage. However, they must be used carefully. Fake news is widespread, and the constant exposure to images of death, famine, and destruction can have a desensitizing effect, numbing our conscience. Films also play a key role in portraying reality, or rather, the version of reality the director wants the viewer to empathize with. They can be a very effective way to reach people, but it's equally important to consider the intention behind them. Films can also be used as tools of manipulation or even brainwashing, as seen, for example, in Russia and Ukraine with the use of cartoons for propaganda purposes. The goal of our podcast episode was to emphasize how critical thinking should always remain active within us. We must be ready to read reality with a questioning mind rather than blindly believing everything we are told or exposed to. There's always another side to the truth, and one that's often hidden. Thank you for listening.